and I'm so glad to be joined once again by my co-host from The Count, Alana Sibin.
Thanks, Emily, and great to be back with you all. Today, we are discussing the two super important Georgia U.S. Senate runoff races. They're coming up on January 5th. 3 weeks ago, on November 3rd, no candidate in either of Georgia's Senate races finished with 50% of the vote. So the top two vote getters in the election advanced to the January runoffs. These races will determine control of the U.S. Senate and the fate of President-elect Joe Biden's agenda.
Yeah, let's be really clear about the stakes here. Republicans currently control 50 of the 100 seats in the U.S. Senate. That means that Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is already promising to block as much of the Biden agenda as possible, as much of the administration's progressive laws and appointments and all of it. He's just going to say no to all of it. This includes cabinet picks. It includes the most basic positions necessary to run the government, and he is not bluffing. So McConnell, as you will recall, blocked President Obama's Supreme Court pick, Merrick Garland, even though he was the specific justice mentioned by top Republican Senate leadership, as being an acceptable Supreme Court candidate. So McConnell at that time, as you will recall, argued that, oh, well, it's an election year. We can't possibly appoint a Supreme Court justice. The next president should decide who gets nominated to the Supreme Court if it's an election year. Fast forward a few years, and you may remember that back in October, Mitch McConnell pushed through the nomination of now Justice Amy Coney Barrett to replace the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He did this in record time, in an election year. There were days to go before the end of voting. If I recall correctly, it was well into early voting that Justice Barrett was in fact confirmed. This is violating, of course, the exact principle that McConnell used to block Garland's confirmation. So in fact, on the night that Justice Ginsburg passed, Mitch McConnell was calling Donald Trump to pressure him to nominate someone as fast as possible. Now let's kind of bring that Senate obstructionism and the McConnell way of doing business home. We're in a pandemic. 2020 has been a uniquely dangerous and lethal year for hundreds of thousands of Americans. More and more Americans are in need of urgent relief in order to get by through this winter. Now, during the pandemic, the House passed a $3 trillion COVID relief bill, the HEROES Act, that would have provided another round of stimulus checks, shored up multiple parts of the economy, and increased access to health care and protective equipment. McConnell blocked that from even getting a vote on the Senate floor. So now Mitch McConnell is saying that Donald Trump is 100% within his rights to challenge Biden's election because Republican Senate leadership thinks they need Trump voters to win these Georgia elections. So essentially what's happening in the Senate right now, the Republican-controlled Senate, is absolute obstructionism and a total focus on fruitless election-related lawsuits over getting urgent relief to ordinary Americans.
And back in Georgia, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, who are two Trump-supporting Republican candidates in the runoffs, both oppose stimulus checks for working families, have fought to kill the Affordable Care Act and its guaranteed insurance coverage of pre-existing conditions by voting against the ACA and supporting lawsuits against it. So if either of these two candidates win, Mitch McConnell is going to be able to block stimulus checks from coming to you and your family. Women could go to jail for having an abortion. Justice Amy Coney Barrett being on the Supreme Court means that there is a conservative tilt, and that means that the Supreme Court is more likely to uphold heartbeat laws, and only a Democratic Senate majority would be able to expand the court to even her out. So your ability to access health care, to not be criminalized for having an abortion, all of these things will evaporate depending on this election. And your ability to access healthcare will particularly evaporate if you have some kind of pre-existing condition, which is more than 100 million Americans. And that's why this race is so important. These two January 5th runoff elections are so important. Right now, Democrats may have won the White House. but they cannot stop Mitch McConnell's plan to obstruct the sweeping mandate for change that the American people gave Joe Biden unless they also win the Senate. And that depends on Democrats winning not one, but both of these seats. If Democrats do win these 2 seats, that means that Democrats will control the Senate, not Mitch McConnell. And this matters. Why does it matter? Well, unlike Mitch McConnell, Democrats could pass a host of legislation, including $3 trillion in pandemic relief. They could also take steps to, again, restore the balance of the Supreme Court, which now has a 6-3 conservative majority. And if it's left unaddressed, that means it will tilt the court for decades to come. It will jeopardize landmark decisions from Roe v. Wade, protecting a woman's right to choose, to the Affordable Care Act, to voting rights, to protections for the gay community, and so much more.
It would also mean that all of us have to look at Mitch McConnell's perennially startled face a lot less, which I would be totally grateful for. So let's talk about these totally essentially important Senate runoff races in Georgia. Democrats need them to take back control of the Senate. And we've talked about this already, but incumbent senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler are both ardent supporters of President Trump and of Mitch McConnell. Now, Perdue is being challenged by Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff was, of course, endorsed by the late civil rights icon and Congressman John Lewis. And Ossoff is running on a platform that includes debt-free public college, a new Voting Rights Act, and reducing prescription drug and health insurance costs, something that I suspect is very popular in a region that needs healthcare in a pandemic year, 2020, that just keeps on giving. Now, Loeffler is facing Reverend Raphael Warnock, the current leader of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which is, of course, the church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. Warnock has demanded that the next stimulus package include funding for communities hardest hit by the pandemic, that is, disproportionately communities of color. He says that healthcare is a human right. He is promising to work toward a green economy that is sustainable and protects the planet for our children and their children and the future of humanity. That's the runoff we're looking at.
And the outcome of this runoff will decide what kind of country we have for the next 2 years. Is it going to be a country that's guided by the Biden administration, the administration that garnered a historic 80 million votes on its promise to build back the economy and end the pandemic? Or is it going to be one controlled by Mitch McConnell, who is the embodiment of Trump's policies that the American people so decisively voted out? And so this all raises this really important question, which is, could Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff win their respective races as Democrats in Georgia, which is a traditionally deep red state? The answer is yes. Let's talk about 2 weeks ago. President-elect Biden won the popular vote in Georgia and its 16 electoral votes. This is the first time that this has happened in a quarter century, since 1992. First time that a Democrat carried Georgia, and that is no mistake. It's the culmination of voter outreach, registration, turnout efforts by on-the-ground organizers in Georgia. It's not a fluke. This is real, and Georgia is now a firmly purple state that Democrats can win.
But it's not easy to win. These races will not be easy for Democrats. Nobody can kind of take their eye off the ball on this one. Here's the biggest problem. In the last 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia, everybody got real excited about the presidential. We got out the vote, and there were parties and Twitter videos of people with I voted stickers and long lines. But in the runoff, there is historically a big drop-off in voter turnout. In the last 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia, voter turnout in the runoff was 40% lower than in the general election. And of course, a disproportionate percentage of that was Democrats who voted in the general and then didn't show up for the runoff. In other words, runoffs already tend to favor Republicans. However, we are also living in a world where the president is making constant, totally baseless claims about election fraud and voting machine conspiracies. And this has caused some members of his base to begin an anti-voting campaign that could, of course, hurt Republican turnout. Now, there are people on the ground working incredibly hard to make sure that people continue to turn out the vote in Georgia in January. Democratic organizers like the New Georgia Project and Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight campaign are working overtime to fight voter suppression, to register voters, to get out the vote, to keep the November momentum going.
Right. And these historic efforts, these heroic and historic efforts are absolutely working. So let's talk about, for example, 2016 compared to today. So between 2016 to 2020, organizers decreased the percentage of eligible but unregistered voters from 22%, to get this, just 2%. But believe it or not, that number still leaves tens of thousands of unregistered voters in a state that was decided by fewer than 90,000 votes during the presidential election. But it's also important to note that there is still so much more work to do. Let's talk a little bit more numbers. We have 2.4 million eligible Black voters in Georgia. And the most recent election data shows that of those 2.4 million eligible Black voters, about 2.1 million are registered in Georgia. So that means that more than 200,000 Black voters who are eligible to vote are still unregistered. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So in 2012, when Obama was elected to his second term, Black voters made up 30% of the electorate. And that number has since gone down to 27.7% in 2016 and 27% in 2020. But at the same time, Black voters, although they make up a smaller percentage of the electorate in Georgia overall, almost half of Biden's gains came from Black voters. They came from the four largest counties, Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, and Cobb, all in the Atlanta metro area, and all with large Black populations. And Black voters have heavily preferred Democrats up and down the ticket historically. And so if Black voters represent a higher share of the electorate in January, Ossoff and Warnock could win. So when we talk about Georgia turning from red to purple to maybe one day blue, Black voters are an important part of that. And the Republicans know this. And so, Emily, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how they are working to disenfranchise voters in this runoff?
Yeah, it's extra gross to talk about because it is so racially biased. I mean, it's like the question of voter suppression in Georgia is a question of suppressing, of course, primarily Black voters. We could spend an entire episode going into the history of that in the South in America. We may.
And we have on the count. Go back and
have on the count. We may again. It continues to be relevant. So, of course, Stacey Abrams is not the only one who's working to impact voters in the runoff election. People who want Mitch McConnell to remain in power. They want to continue obstructionist policies. They want more conservative judges. They want to outlaw abortion, end the Affordable Care Act. They are trying to make sure that you don't vote. So, for example, Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp is working to disenfranchise Georgia voters. He's purging rolls of supposedly inactive voters and securing legal victories that overturned a court requirement that Georgia count ballots postmarked by Election Day and received up to 3 days after. Just to go back for a quick second on that, like purging rolls of supposedly inactive voters, the reason that's a big deal is that governments don't usually get that right. A lot of people find themselves sort of surprise unregistered, either because they missed an election, really for no reason that has anything to do with the legitimacy of their registration or their right to vote. So it's a way of throwing up a surprise barrier and not notifying people in a proper way that actually works. Essentially, it's a way of taking people's right to vote away without them knowing. So he's continued to try to suppress voters in communities of color. Lawsuits against Georgia during the 2020 primary elections say that the average minimum evening wait time was nearly an hour at polling places where 90% of the registered voters were people of color. The current Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, is expanding these practices started by Kemp. They were started by Kemp when he was Secretary of State. Now the current Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, has taken up that baton, freezing voter registrations for 50,000 Georgians, 70% of whom were Black. Raffensperger is going back to this inactive voter thing, where he wants to shift people's voter status to inactive if absentee ballot applications are returned as undeliverable. regardless of the circumstances of our phenomenally broken postal system's inability to deliver the application. In other words, the Postal Service does that thing where they go to your house and leave a note that's completely illegible about what they tried to deliver and when. And then you go to the post office and they're like, oh, sorry, we're completely backlogged. Please come back in 2 weeks. And then you go back and they're like, your package is gone, which, by the way, has happened to me. If that happens to you in Georgia, well, Brad Raffensperger is ready to take your right to vote away.
And he wouldn't be trying to do it if it wasn't so important. So vote, vote, vote. And vote again. Well, don't vote again.
Don't vote again.
Don't vote again. Don't vote again.
Well, I guess actually, Alana, it's arguably voting again because people voted in the presidential and now they are voting again properly in the runoff. So please vote again. Vote again in the runoff.
You voted in November. Vote again in January.
Yes.
Once in January, one in November. Because this matters so much. Because if America is going to move on from the Trump agenda, which is what so many Americans voted to do, Democrats have to win these two races. It's super critical, and it requires people turning out in big numbers to vote in January, just like they did in November. So we are going to give you some important dates, some important information. I'm going to give folks a few seconds to get out your phones, to figure out how to screenshot on your computer if that's something you want to do.
Or a piece of paper and a pencil. An available technology.
Or you can do that if you want to do that. Or get out a piece of paper and a pencil.
Carve it into a tablet.
There you go. So here are the three things that you need to know if you are a voter in Georgia. 1, the registration deadline. So the voter registration deadline is next week, December 7th. And this is really interesting. So any Georgia resident who will be 18 years old by January 5th, 2021, and is registered to vote by December 7th, 2020, can cast a ballot in the runoff. And that includes the approximately 23,000 people who are too young to vote in the November 3rd presidential election, but will turn 18 by January 5th. And that's a significant number, again, in a close state like Georgia. So voters, check your registration status at www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. If your status is inactive, you may be at risk of losing your voter registration at any time. So contact your local county registrar and be sure to vote in the upcoming election. Number 2, bring a photo ID. Not all states do this, but if you are voting in person in Georgia, state law requires that you bring a photo ID card, like a driver's license, or a free photo ID card that you can obtain from Georgia's Department of Driver Services or your county registrar. And 3, if you are requesting an absentee ballot, plan ahead. You may want to do this because we are living in a pandemic, so it absolutely makes sense. But you must request an absentee ballot because Georgia does not send absentee ballots automatically. If you need an absentee ballot, go to ballotrequest.sos.ga.gov. It's easy. And if you want to check the status of your ballot, you can go to www.mvp.sos.ga.gov. You can mail your absentee ballot. You can drop it off at an early voting drop box, the same way you could at during the November election.
Oh, so there it is. All eyes are on Georgia. Other than the Biden-Trump presidential election itself, these January 5th U.S. Senate runoffs are the most critically important elections in the country. Mitch McConnell's majority leadership has set new standards for obstructionism, hypocrisy, partisanship, sort of disregarding the rules. And if Joe Biden is going to have a chance to actually govern as he was elected to do, to try healing the soul of the nation as his campaign has promised, it starts with having people in the Senate who are willing to listen, willing to be partners in governance, not people looking to shut down pandemic relief or stop judicial and cabinet appointments or otherwise obstruct the ability of the government to function in the middle of the worst global public health crisis in a century. So to all our viewers, we hope very much that you engage with this election, that you help groups on the ground organize. If you are on the ground, if you feel comfortable and safe, join a group. That you push to help make sure that every eligible Georgia voter's voice is heard. Thank you so much for joining us on The Appeal Live. We're going to be back again tomorrow to talk about the New Orleans District Attorney runoff election. And you can follow us. You can follow The Appeal News on Facebook or The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. This is Alana Sivan, and we are so glad to have joined you. Thanks again.